Looks like we're live.
Hello to everybody that's joining us. We're going to give it about 5 minutes for more people to jump in before we begin. So give it to about 8:35, my time at least, and then we'll get started. To anyone who's just now joining, we'll be starting in about a minute. So about 8:35 Eastern time, we will begin. Okay, it's 8:35, so we're going to start. As people roll in, we'll be getting underway with our introductions. So just to begin framing the conversation tonight, welcome to our NPEC event. My name is Evan. This was also organized with Tom. Tom, thank you very much for assisting with that. And we have a great panel tonight. This is the Red and Green, a Revolutionary Green New Deal event. Red and green because we are socialists, but we are also socialists fighting for a Green New Deal. We are not just fighting for worker power, but worker power over a sustainable planet. I will not be doom and gloom and get into all the details of how we're facing climate catastrophe, because we already know that things aren't great right now, but there's hope in that. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. Particularly, we're going to be talking about specific case studies around the US and internationally. Things that we can look towards, not just as a sign of hope, but also as an example of what the future can look like, and then examine some of the radical possibilities therein. So with that, I'm going to introduce some of our speakers, and then we'll get to hear from them. So our first speaker tonight will be Sean Estelle, who was member of DSA's National Political Committee from 2019 to 2021. And they're going to talk about a case study coming out of Chicago. Then we will hear from Keith Brower-Brown, who is a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley, who's going to talk about California Central Valley. And then we'll hear from Patrick Bigger, who is a research director at the Climate and Community Project and a research policy analyst at the Sociospatial Climate Collaborative at UC Berkeley. And then later in the evening, we'll also be hearing from Sarahana Shrestha, who is a candidate currently running for New York State Assembly in the 103rd District. So with that, I'm going to pass it off first to Sean. I have two questions for you. One, what climate organizing experience do you have, and what does the Green New Deal mean to you?
Yeah, thanks so much, Evan and Tom and the DSA staff that put this call together, and to the other speakers. Thanks to everybody that's joining tonight. Climate organizing experience, I got politicized by the Occupy movement in 2011 while I was a student at UC San Diego, and then was a part of a environmental justice collective on campus where I really learned a lot about the climate crisis and its immediate connection to the struggles around privatization of higher education, around Palestine solidarity, around worker struggles that were happening on campus. And then when I moved to Chicago in 2014, it just kind of continued taking that path of seeing the way that climate change and the climate crisis was interconnected with all of our struggles. So I worked as a fossil fuel divestment campaigner for a group called Power Shift Network for about 5 years, and then worked to develop the Green New Deal politics within DSA and the Democratized ComEd campaign, which I'll talk about. And then in terms of what the Green New Deal means with DSA specifically, it means something pretty specific. So in 2018, when the Green New Deal hit mainstream political discourse, the National DSA Eco-Socialist Working Group created a whole set of principles that I'm dropping right now into the chat that were endorsed by about 100 chapters, every single ideological caucus, and the national organization. It was 7 major principles that pointed towards potential campaigns in the future while not having a really specific set of strategies and goals, because we wanted to create political buy-in and then from there actually propose a campaign within DSA as a whole. And utilize the political moment that we were in with the presidential primary. So it was about democratization of major energy resources, thinking about decarbonization timelines, having an internationalist focus, a lot of the big picture left flank work that was starting to appear in the discourse around the Green New Deal that had a very specific eco-socialist politics, while also then looking forward towards the process that it would take to create a strategy. So once we got that campaign passed, we did a lot of work around the DSA for Bernie campaign, and then went through a really intensive process in 2020 where we brought together 80 to 100 chapters and went through a whole strategy convening to create a 5-year plan to win a jobs guarantee. And the first steps along that path in 2021 were the ProAct campaign and the DSA Green New Deal for public schools work that happened in the summer and the fall. So at this point, the parameters of what I think a Green New Deal is within DSA as a whole is like pretty clear. But that's a lot of what the national organization has been fighting for. And so I think there's a lot of contradictions when it comes to the local chapters and to other organizations outside of DSA and the other politics and fellow travelers that we're in motion with as well.
Yes, and I'm definitely excited to hear more about that part in particular when we get to you. So I'm going to now pass it off to Keith. Keith, I'm going to ask you the same questions. What climate organizing experience do you have, and what does the Green New Deal mean to you?
So I've been trying to do some kind of climate organizing since high school or college, but I'll just mention one thing. In DSA, when a huge part of our state was burning in California in 2018, I helped with a group of folks, a lot in the East Bay and a lot from 8 other chapters around the state, to start a campaign to try and take our electric and gas utility public out here called Let's Own PG&E. Although we ran into some headwinds from the capitalists who run the state, we were able to agitate and build a list of over 10,000 people who were excited about that idea around the state and get some media coverage. Good step, but it was difficult to build worker support and kind of deeper organized support for it. And that led me to a lot of the focus that I've worked on now over the last few years on labor activism. We got to build the power to do this kind of stuff if we're ever going to do it. So to that end, just Sean is a really hard act to follow on what the Green New Deal is. Just one more thought I'll add is that as much as we want to reach democratic socialism, it's going to be really hard to do that in the time that we have climate-wise. So part of the idea of the Green New Deal is that as we take on the climate crisis, we can be building the power and the solidarity across race, gender, across national borders that it's going to take to reach the socialist society we need. So I think that's a really important idea. It's kind of this idea of like a non-reformist reform. We're fighting for reforms now to make capitalism, to take the edge off, but the point is not just to take the edge off, it's to build the power. We need to go a lot further.
Excellent, thank you. And that really does get to the heart of the idea of the revolutionary nature of the Green New Deal, in and of itself not being a revolutionary act per se, but that it leads to more revolutionary avenues of power. So Patrick, I'll ask you the same question, and then we'll kind of get into the more the case study portion of tonight. What climate organizing experience do you have, and what does the Green New Deal mean to you?
Great, thanks, Evan. It's a real pleasure to join you all tonight. My experience with climate organizing goes back to, I was living in Tucson, Arizona when the Iraq War started in 2003, and we were doing a lot of anti-war organizing. And Tucson had a lot of really great early radical climate work going on there. It's where the Center for Biological Diversity was based. The Earth First Journal was published out of Tucson at the time. And I was lucky to get looped in with those folks who helped me understand better the relationship between militarism, imperialism, and the climate crisis. And so that's really how I got looped into it. And then that turned into more environmental work, a lot around George W. Bush's Healthy Forest Initiative that sought to, modernize the Forest Service as basically a timber management organization, and trying to fight against that and improve public control over public lands and public resources, as well as linking climate to migrant justice issues in Southern Arizona, and thinking about how the climate crisis combined with border militarization was making border crossing more dangerous for undocumented people. And so that's sort of how I got my start. And then that kind of grew into my now former academic career, where I've been working on the financialization of nature and kind of neoliberal approaches to climate management, and trying to work with civil society organizations to help kind of popularize understanding of how different financial interventions like cap and trade, or green bonds, or private equity for biodiversity conservation are all kind of false solutions that kick the can down the road. And now at the Climate and Community Project, which I'll say more about during my longer talk, we work with movements to really design the policies that will form the basis for the decade of the Green New Deal, and the sort of transformative potential that we really need to harness if we're going to avoid the worst of the climate crisis.
Awesome, thank you.
In terms of what a Green New Deal means to us, sorry, let me just say real quick, because Johanna at CCP would be mad at me if I did mention that we think of the Green New Deal as an investment forward approach to dealing with climate change that delivers material benefits to working people, so that when people see, oh, this is climate policy, that's for me, not, oh, that's for the suburbs, or that's for somebody else, right? We need to be delivering material benefits for working people through public investment.
Excellent, thank you. So with that, we're going to get into the deeper portion where each of our guests here tonight are going to talk about a particular case study that they are involved in or have been studying. So let's start with Sean. I have a few questions for you to kind of frame before I hand off the mic to you. So first off, you gave a little bit of detail about like what the Green New Deal is, but like in the most succinct terms, like what is the Green New Deal? Another question is, why do we use the Green New Deal as the framing for this kind of legislation, this kind of push, rather than some other term? What can DSA members across the country learn in particular from any activist work that's been or organizing work that's been going on in the Chicago area? What difference is there between a left Green New Deal and maybe some of the proposals that are coming out of more moderate Democrats? And then particularly, what is the revolutionary potential in the case study that you'll speak about? You have about 10 minutes to talk about that, but please, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks. I I want to use a case study from a campaign that I worked with some other people to build from the ground up in Chicago that actually did not use Green New Deal framing as a way to juxtapose and talk about where the Green New Deal came from and some of the reasons why the Green New Deal is a really important frame right now, and what makes left Green New Deal politics very different than liberal Green New Deal politics. So, very briefly, the Green New Deal didn't appear out of nowhere. It was used by the Green Party, by advocacy organizations in Europe that were pressuring the UN, and by parts of the youth climate movement in the United States for nearly a decade. And then in fall of 2018, it was adopted by a recently elected Democratic Socialist named Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who brought it to organizers at the Sunrise Movement that were planning a green jobs protest at the White House in November of 2018. That frame immediately caught fire and inspired lots of campaigns and media engagement. And a lot of people that were already working on campaigns had to pivot and think about how the work that they were already doing was going to fit into this floating signifier, this new frame that was really focused on, I think the way that Patrick described it, of like really material investments for ordinary people. That was a callback to a historical era of social democratic reforms in the original New Deal, and trying to bring together historically divided constituencies in labor and environmentally impacted communities. So in 2018, shortly before the Green New Deal really consolidated a lot of that, some of us in Chicago were made aware that a 30-year contract between the city and the private electric utility ComEd was coming up for renegotiation. We decided to put together a campaign demanding that the city municipalize the utility or take it over for public ownership. And so I'm going to link to a copy of the original campaign proposal that we wrote that goes in depth about basically why we thought this was a good idea, how it would build the power of DSA and the broader working class in Chicago, and then what some of our potential demands were. So our demands were a combination of structural reforms that would lay the groundwork for a democratically controlled, publicly owned utility that could then be pressured through mass action campaigns to create state investments in decarbonization work that were removed from the market and removed from, the insane profit motive and corruption that has been a historic problem at this investor-owned utility and all investor-owned utilities, and also immediate demands for ratepayers interacting with the utility as customers. We also really wanted to make sure that we were thinking about workers that were employed by the utility, in large part because there's a history in Chicago of very corrupt politics, people raiding pensions. And so we knew that that would be an issue if we took all these workers and said, hey, we want to get you to be employed by the city and like get your pension lumped in with all of these other pensions that have been going through a crisis forever. So there were some things that worked very well. We were able to make a really appealing case to DSA members, to people whose doors we knocked on, and also to the recently elected DSA champions to city council in 2019, that rooting a campaign to address the climate crisis, which is often this big, huge problem in people's immediate material conditions, their electricity bills, could build a base of people beyond the ones that already care about climate change. We were also able to do a lot of political education about the history of public ownership during the New Deal, socialist experiments in other countries, and a lot of the work that was in motion and connecting it to DSA politics at large. Things like the Medicare for All campaign and concepts like a just transition for workers out of extractive industries. However, there was also a lot that did not work well. The major union representing ComEd line workers settled a contract renegotiation behind closed doors before the campaign started, and we were never able to implement a serious mass organizing strategy that employed tactics like canvassing in a really systematic way. This was in large part because our campaign was not using enough of the opportunities around the Green New Deal framing at a state and national level. And so other organizations were not as interested in coalition building. We would bring a pitch to them about this campaign, and they would say, what does this have to do with the GND? And I think it was like a missed opportunity there, basically. So in terms of the difference between left Green New Deal politics and other versions of the Green New Deal that I think this and other work that I've talked about really emphasize for me, is that as socialists, we need to understand the ways in which the climate crisis permeates every aspect of politics today, and the need for immediate reforms that can mitigate the worst damage while still staying focused on the political horizon of a fundamentally different world. What differentiates DSA from Democrats and progressives that support a more liberal version of the Green New Deal is twofold. First, an understanding of who we need to organize in order to win, that the demands of science and the political conditions are creating, and then also an understanding of the type of organization that needs to be built. And the answer to both of those questions is the one that Marx wrote about a long ass time ago, and that the socialist movement has built itself on ever since. We have to create member-funded, mass democratic organizations of workers that are concentrated in specific industries that can use their ultimate weapon, the withholding of their labor through strikes, in order to create systemic crises and force the class with power to give some of it up. The only way to do that is through patiently moving groups of people together through democratic processes where problems are identified, collective decisions are made, and then they act on those decisions together, always focused on bringing more people in. I could talk about the differences in potential policies, but I'll leave that to other folks. And I think the really fundamental lesson is about the type of organization and who it is that we're organizing. And so to conclude, I'll just say very quickly that the revolutionary potential for me, I was able to identify a key moment that happened during the campaign. There was one weekend in July or August of summer 2019 where we had city council members that were working on whipping votes for a resolution that was gonna demand that the mayor put public ownership on the table as an option and for the upcoming negotiations. We didn't know if it was gonna pass because we only held 10% of the city council, and it was kind of a big demand. The day that it passed with a majority of votes was the same day that Bill de Blasio got on camera in New York City and said that public ownership should be on the table with Con Ed in New York because a blackout had just rolled through some of the poorest neighborhoods in the city on one of the hottest days of the year. And that was a campaign that was being pushed by New York City DSA's Eco-Socialist Working Group. And then about a month later, Bernie Sanders came out with a new climate plan, and he released a video that featured that campaign that Keith talked about, the Let's Own PG&E campaign. And so it was in the air, and it was this moment where we were actually able to put forward a different vision for what is possible. And so all of those campaigns were really deeply instrumental in grounding the eco-socialist work of the Green New Deal principles and then the strategy that we then developed. And I think that that horizon is still possible, and we need to keep pushing for that internationalist, publicly owned, worker-led revolutionary future.
Wonderful, thank you. I do have a follow-up question, and also to the other speakers, you're more than welcome to ask any questions if you have yourself. And also for anyone in the audience, I just want to say if you have any questions that you would like to ask the speakers, we do have the Q&A box. So throughout the course of this, feel free to submit questions there, and we'll have a little bit of time for that at the end. But Sean, the question I have for you is, you're talking a lot about the kind of local efforts and how they're combining with things that are happening outside of the local area. So for one, I wanted to ask, how do you identify the specific motions that you should go through as an organizer to make sure that what you're doing locally is addressing local issues? How do you ID those issues, and how does that affect your approach? Because when we're talking about a national Green New Deal, that might not have the nuances that local organizing would have. So how do you how do you treat that balance, and how do you find what those local issues are?
Yeah, totally. So I think that a lot of it has to do with, when you're trying to cut an issue for a campaign, there's a whole set of questions that you have to ask with the people that are in the room around the strategic benefits, what is it that we're going to have to do in order to actually win the campaign, in order to have the power that we need to win the campaign, who has to be in the room to make it happen, and then also what, for those of us that have ideological grounding as socialists, then also the question becomes what is the campaign that is worth our time, our energy, who do we want to be organizing in order to get us one step closer to what we think that the theory that we have is going to result in being closer to socialism. And so in the case of the ComEd campaign specifically, this opportunity was a once in a 30-year opportunity where we had the city had a franchise agreement And there were very few other organizations that were even aware of it, let alone were campaigning on it. And so it seemed like a really big opportunity for Chicago DSA to intervene, because we did not have any eco-socialist campaigns that were already happening. And for us to say, okay, we have a base of people here, and we also have people that are running for office in a few months. And so those two things combined are going to allow us to potentially make an intervention in local politics that would be larger than what we are as like a 1,500 person organization at the time, and really put serious demands on the table that may not lead to full municipalization and a full public takeover, but it might lead to some of the intermediate demands, like a shorter franchise agreement or a progressive rate structure for ratepayers, or also starting to actually build ties with the line workers union, so that we could have people show up in solidarity if their contract negotiations did not go well. If jobs opened up, people could think about getting jobs and industrializing there. And so all of those things together led to a really potent moment that we knew we wanted to intervene in. And so I think that that is oftentimes the case with local campaigns, is being able to like spot that intervention moment and then moving on it.
Awesome, thank you so much. That's actually a great transition to Keith, since Keith is going to be talking about more of this labor element here. So Keith, I have a number of questions that I'm going to ask you, and then just the same, I'll pass the mic off to you. So first off, how can unions and the labor movement help to fix environmental harms? What's their role in it? What can we learn specifically from the example that you're bringing to us today in California? How do we move established unions politics to the left? What role does environmental activism play in that effort? And also, what is the revolutionary potential in that case?
Thanks, Evan. I'll start with just the sort of general question of like, why should we care about unions or labor in this? And Sean set it up perfectly. It's like, there's a power in the workplace that's really important. We keep, as climate activists, I feel like for many years, I've done a lot of work that's trying to like bring public attention to this issue of climate change and hope that like we can convince the policymakers to do the right thing on this. But we haven't really had like direct leverage. And there is in the workplace a very direct leverage of you can shut down production, you can shut down a refinery, you can say you're not going to keep working at the refinery if you don't force the company to put in the contract that they're going to reduce pollution on a certain schedule. The United Steelworkers talked about doing that in their national contract this year. They didn't end up pushing super hard on that issue, but it showed that that sort of thing's possible. Construction unions in Australia in the 70s, in bits and pieces until now, have refused to build projects that they say are environmentally or socially destructive at times, called green bans. So that's the sort of direct workplace leverage that's really exciting. If you don't work, it's not going to get built. It's not going to happen. There's also a more like broad leverage that workers have, which is like, we're connected. We have to show up to work every day and build relationships with each other. And we bring this whole web of relationships in our world around us there too. And so it's this one place in our very like alienated, isolating society where we have to come together. And often our work connects us to a broader community. If you're a teacher, your students, a nurse, your patients, those are connections you can use to organize a broader political movement. To shake up the state, to win elections, change politics in a big way. So those are really important kinds of power that are there in the workplace in a way that it's been hard to find in a lot of other places. I wrote an article about this. I'll just drop it. If anybody wants to hear more about like some of these examples in general, beyond my specific case, I wrote this article a couple months ago, kind of making that case, and would love any feedback. The case I'm going to present today is the first time I'm presenting publicly on my dissertation research, which I've been working on and collaborating with people in the San Joaquin Valley in California for the past 5 years. And I'm really honored to get to do it with comrades here across the country, including a lot of very experienced labor environment connectors I recognize in the participants. I'm gonna share my screen if you give me 1 second. Okay, not that one, but this one. Cool. Can people see the slides okay? Okay, cool. I'm gonna hide as much as I can here. Okay. So I'm gonna talk about how an alliance of building trade unions and environmental justice and immigrant groups has come together in bits and pieces in the Fresno region of California. This is not an alliance across the board on everything, but it's still a pretty exciting one to see happen. This is not a full Green New Deal happening at all. But it's some really important steps towards that where I think we can learn some lessons as socialists. So first off, we need to start with the fact that building trades have a bad rap, often for some real reasons. There is leadership in many members in building trade unions. Building trades are electricians, construction workers in general who are unionized, carpenters, iron workers, huge range of categories. And often leaders in the building trades and some members have been really defensive of fossil fuel projects, other kinds of dirty industry. I'm gonna pull up my notes here, make sure I don't get lost or off time. And so it's unexpected to see building trades doing any kind of alliance. But there's huge potential leverage here. Building trades were some of the first unions to organize in the United States, are powerful in many places in the US where there's almost no other union presence. And that's because without construction work, capital is stuck. It can't build new factories or new infrastructure. So that's a lot of very fundamental leverage to work off of. For this alliance to happen in this place is also pretty surprising. So we're talking here about the San Joaquin Valley in Central California between San Francisco and LA. It's an area famous for really intense air and water pollution, most keenly felt by the Latino or Latinx majority in the region, with a lot of intense poverty as shown in this state metric of poverty and pollution, with the red area being the valley where I focus this work. And it's a famous area too for having a really powerful ruling class with their power based in being real estate developers, agribusiness developers, and prison developers. So how the hell did this alliance come about here of all places is a big question. One important ingredient that helped this breakthrough begin to happen is that there is an infusion of thousands of jobs building solar power plants and high-speed rail. High-speed rail connecting, someday hopefully connecting San Francisco to LA, has begun to be built for the past 5 or so years, 7, 8 years, right around Fresno. Fresno is where it started being built. And so there's been over 3,000 jobs on rail so far that are all union construction jobs, basically. And on solar power plants in California, as opposed to the rest of the country where most solar jobs are non-union, especially rooftop solar is like a total disaster for unions. For power plants, for utility scale solar, it's been almost all union in California for most of the past decade. So that meant that with some of the biggest power plants, solar power plants in the world getting built near Fresno, there's been thousands of jobs being created for unions out there. So this is kind of a test of a theory we've had with the Green New Deal, that if you create unionized green jobs, it could help lead to political transformation. And this shows some proof of that theory, that it can help create that foundation, I think. But that alone isn't enough. It's not just enough that there were more union jobs. It was also that who could get those jobs changed. Around the country, construction unions have tended to be whiter than the heavily undocumented non-union construction sector. Here in the Fresno area, growing unions brought in a lot more second-generation Mexican-American workers, formerly incarcerated workers especially. They kind of saw it as a way to both build their political legitimacy as a union and to actually build deeper roots in the communities they're in. And those deeper roots help to shape their politics and shake their leadership a little bit. Then there's an alliance that came together, not just because of those deeper roots, but because environmental justice and immigrant organizers had some resources and unions had resources that each other needed. One side, the organizers had a pipeline of activists, of candidates, contacts, and policies in development. And unions had tons of dues money suddenly from their members paying in dues. And they had lots of members, thousands of members, who could canvass and run in local elections. And interestingly, it was a shared experience, I've heard a lot, of political isolation that helped bring them together. It was the fact that they had a shared enemy, this local ruling class that was very powerful, this conservative domination in local politics that had been shutting both sides out. Well, that helped bring together both sides of this alliance. It was their political marginalization that actually made it more likely for them to test out new strategies and make new alliances that they don't make in big blue cities super often. And then what did they do with this alliance? A major focus of where they actually allied, I mean, the most concrete ways they allied were in local elections and many local policy fights. So they supported local election challengers for city council, mayor races in towns and cities throughout this region. They won 16 out of 22 challengers to incumbents with candidates who were largely Latinx or many of them Bernie supporters. And then they worked together on policy breakthroughs that guaranteed union labor on city construction and have redistributed infrastructure budgets to make sure there's clean water, parks, street lights for pedestrians in neighborhoods that have been denied those things on the poor, more brown sides of town for a long time in a lot of these cities. So I think there's some lessons in here for what a sort of rallying program could be in other places, because I think there are many places in the country where there's a powerful ruling class minority ruling over a multiracial working class of color. That's too common a story. And I think part of what helped bring this labor and community organization alliance together was some shared goals. First, to strengthen labor and build its power. And second, to what you could say is fighting eco-apartheid. So first, strengthening labor, these two sides agreed on guaranteeing union jobs and public construction and pushing for more union jobs, and on pressuring bosses using state power. So pressuring Amazon. If Amazon wants to build a new warehouse here, we can use the state to say, you're not going to get a permit for that until you agree to labor standards, for example. That's something they're talking about there. Second, fighting eco-apartheid. So ending like segregation of infrastructure. This is, city budgets do not have a ton of money necessarily, but all these groups could agree that it should be redistributed more equitably to working class communities. And so redistributing that infrastructure budget was a real point of agreement, and there were jobs in that. And there is some agreement on supporting care work too, on supporting schools, alternatives to prisons, and the kind of care work necessary for that. So these are some rallying points. It's not a Green New Deal exactly. It doesn't have that full ambition, but it helps bring together the forces that might be needed to win that Green New Deal in this case. And just with my last slide, I just want to sit with those limits for a second and talk about what we could do to help overcome them. This wasn't a Green New Deal exactly, not like universal ambitious programs. Neither of these sides is aiming for workers to set the direction of industry or to own industry, which is a problem because some of these building trades, many of them still kind of defer to, well, if the investors want to build a dirty factory, we'll go along with it still. They're don't have the ambition to take over the capital itself and set its direction, except through public work. And that's something we would like to see change to build a deeper alliance here. And finally, even though these are Bernie supporters, a lot of the time, there's not yet really independent party formation in the way that DSA has supported, or a real vision of how to do that. So how could we help overcome those limits and strengthen this kind of beginning? I think socialists have a real role both inside and alongside. Inside, we can take jobs in some of these workplaces. There's connections you build with coworkers. It's really hard to build in any other way as deeply. So we can take rank and file jobs. And if we can't, for whatever reason, there's lots we can do alongside through strike support campaigns, working with rank and file members to help develop politics and a vision, and working in political campaigns when we feel like they're bringing new people into really lasting kinds of action. So those are some of the ideas I've taken from this collaborative research over 5 years, and I'd love to hear your questions and push back on these hypotheses. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Keith. So I do have a quick question, actually. These kind of collaborations that were happening, were they kind of piecemeal? Was there any kind of centralized planning involved with this? Was there a committee that formed between the different groups, or was it more or less just these different pockets of collaboration?
Yeah, good question. The most concrete collaboration was on electoral or policy campaigns specifically, but there were some institutions that played a really important connecting role. The Central Labor Council was a really important one. A young Bernie supporting guy who came out of a building trades family became the head of it and like really had this vision and put a bunch of money into another institution called the Central Valley Project, which was all about trying to create this blue-green alliance or like labor environmental alliance. So those alone wouldn't have made it happen, but they did some important work. And that's something socialists can help do, is kind of, as Sean was saying, you know, get conversations happening that might not happen otherwise.
I had one last thing I thought was really interesting. I felt like there's a little bit of resonance with what you were talking about, with what Sean had just talked about, that there was this kind of political juncture that came into play. That was almost just a natural consequence of the way that the situation was playing out, where there were these people who were politically alienated in such a way that it kind of facilitated them working together. But one thing I always like to look towards in DSA is, you know, making good use of those opportunities when they come around, but also being good at identifying them and knowing how to build on that. So as more of these alliances start to come into play, what is a good strategy, a good approach that maybe a local chapter or organizers can take on to make sure that they're playing either a supportive or leading role in these moments as they come about?
That's a great question. I mean, a lot will depend on the specifics of your situation, but a general principle I found useful comes from a dear mentor of mine who passed away earlier this year, Mike Parker from Democracy's Power fame. He had this real principle guiding him throughout like 50 years of work on the left, that like us on the left, like we're not going to make these mass upsurges happen out of thin air. Like there will be other conditions that kind of lead new alliances and new people to come into action. But what we can contribute in those moments is to support those new people stepping into action to find lasting organization. That's a real key. It's like we need to, if there's this alliance happening, we should try and help it build a kind of formal, lasting organization that's going to keep people together, and not just like a few leaders or staff, but like really keep members of these unions and of these community organizations talking to each other and seeing each other on the same team for the long haul.
All right, great. So with that, we're going to move on to our last speaker. So Patrick, I have a few questions for you. One, how do we ensure that a Green New Deal protects climate refugees, not just current American citizens? How do we make sure that the benefits of Green New Deal policy aren't just limited to the United States? In other words, how do we make sure that it doesn't perpetuate colonial kinds of relationships with other countries? Particularly, what is your organization, the Climate and Community Project, done towards the possibilities of an international Green New Deal? And what other movements or organizations in other countries can we look towards, and where is the revolutionary potential in that?
Great. Thanks, Evan. So I think my talk is going to be a little bit different, because this is really an emerging issue in terms of thinking about how how the Green New Deal fits into, you know, U.S. foreign policy, U.S. trade policy, different aspects of how the U.S. Kind of conducts itself around the world, and you know, really limits the potential of other countries contending with the climate crisis, even while we struggle to make any progress here on our own. And so this talk that I'm going to give comes out of the Climate and Communities Project work on the global Green New Deal. This is one of two main streams we have going. The other one dovetails quite a bit with what Keith was just talking about in interesting ways. A report that we're doing on supply chain justice for critical minerals, especially for batteries, and thinking about how US policy can support the energy transition both domestically, but also abroad, where we source a lot of these critical minerals like lithium and nickel. And so the folks that are going to be building these batteries, how do we ensure that the extractive processes and practices that are needed to pull those out of the ground get into the factories? How do we support a just transition for those folks also, instead of perpetuating these very exploitive, extractive relations all over the world? So I'm not going to talk about that. I can talk about that more in Q&A. But at CCP, we think doing both domestic and international work is critical to fulfilling the promise of the Green New Deal. Much like socialism in general, there's no such thing as a GND or even climate action in one country, right? What we do here has ramifications all over the world because of U.S. economic military power and specifically economic power. So this report that we did on debt justice for climate reparations was timed to coincide with the IMF meetings last week, where the IMF once again continued to kick the can down the road on a simmering debt crisis across the global south that's really about to erupt. And in the US, we've been mobilizing kind of, through the debt collective around, personal debt stuff. But that's not the only debt that we need to work on collectively to get canceled in order to really promote human flourishing. Because right now we're facing these two other kind of conjoined debt crises. The financial debt crisis in the global south that's about to implode. And then on the other side of the ledger, the ecological debt that the US and other northern countries continue to rack up through the hyperconsumption of resources and occupying the space in the atmosphere through all the pollution that we put out at the expense of the rest of the world. And so in thinking about contending with these two kinds of debt, the way that my colleague Olufemi Taiwo and I think about it is through this lens of climate reparations and linking, reparations is obviously a word that comes with a lot of different connotations and a lot of different implications. And so we do this sort of intentionally to provoke thinking about the redress of harms, inequalities exacerbated by climate change, but that are really grounded in 500 years of colonial plunder. And to do those kinds of climate reparations, to create that kind of redress, you've got to deal with the debt issue, because we're really looking at two possible futures, right? An ongoing climate colonialism or climate reparations, where we start to recognize the harms that the US and other northern emissions have caused and are continuing to cause, or this climate reparation. So we can also think about this as a difference between a global Green New Deal or eco-apartheid, like Keith mentioned, but on a global scale. And this comes in, this is one of the places where we can start thinking about people moving around because of climate disruption, which is already happening. I don't want to get too far into that. It's not something that I think CCP has an institutional position on, but just to say that I think the correct, ethical socialist perspective on that is that, we absolutely have to welcome as many people displaced by the climate crisis, given US responsibility for driving climate destabilization as possible. That's not something that we've looked at in detail, though. But we think that migration policy needs to be part of this broader reparative agenda. So to go kind of more empirically into these twin debt crises that we're worried about, and we think that we really need to consider when we're talking about U.S. economic and foreign policy. On the left, you can see the rapidly escalating debts of African countries, which are now high, triple or even quadruple above the raw levels in the 1980s and 1990s during the so-called third world debt crisis. And of course, there's major variation. It's a huge continent with 50 odd countries. But on the whole, we're really going in the wrong direction. And this last line here fell off for a little bit during a period of debt suspension during the pandemic that has since ended. And now debt levels are rising again rapidly. There've been a series of sovereign defaults, starting with Zambia in 2020, most recently Sri Lanka 2 weeks ago. And so countries around the world are really struggling with foreign debt. And this is particularly pernicious because countries that are vulnerable to climate change are already paying more to borrow on international markets than their less vulnerable counterparts, to the tune of like 2% a year, right? And so the more vulnerable you are to climate change, the more you pay to borrow on markets, which in turn makes climate action all the more expensive. And that's a real problem because, as we see here on the right, this is data from Oxfam last year. Among 38 low-income countries, debt payments or just service on debt was 6 times more than they spent on climate adaptation across those countries. So we're facing a real both practical and ethical crisis here, because all this debt is dragging down climate ambition and spending on most social priorities in general. So a failure to deal with debt now locks billions of people into poverty and insecurity. And at the same time, the North and the US in particular continues to increase vulnerability for these folks by not dealing with its own emissions and failing to deliver on climate finance. In Paris, the rich world committed to providing $100 billion in climate finance a year by 2020. They did not make that goal. And in fact, most of what's distributed as climate finance is climate aid. We actually give out as loans to vulnerable countries. So we're actually putting those countries into further debt through the mechanism by which we claim to be helping. And these are some of the aspects where the international solidarity through the Green New Deal has good potential to play a role and deliver some really transformative outcomes. And so these two maps that we made for the report sum up the kind of ethical and economic case for climate reparations through debt justice. On the left, we created an index that shows basically the market-rated creditworthiness of countries, or basically the ability to borrow money cheaply, and we indexed that to climate vulnerability. And so the darker the country means that countries can borrow more cheaply and are less vulnerable to climate shocks, right? So that maps onto a fairly familiar geography, while on the right, we've got a similar index that compares a country's ability to respond to climate shocks in the form of their adaptive capacity, basically the economic, social, institutional capacity to deal with climate shocks, indexed to their historical fossil fuel or greenhouse gas emissions. And so what that map shows you is that the countries that have polluted the most are also the ones with the highest adaptive capacity, or the ability to rapidly decarbonize their economies and deal with climate disruptions as they come. And so what we think that these show together is that countries, especially the US and Europe, that can borrow cheaply should do so and redistribute those resources to vulnerable countries who bear the least responsibility. And so these are our kind of responses to this, 5 ideas at a very general level, where we need immediate debt cancellation of publicly held debt. Biden could suspend debt repayments tomorrow. It would, I think, take Congress to ultimately forgive those debts, but much like student debt, immediate relief is possible. At the same time, we really need to scale up climate finance through grants, through debt, through grants, through technical assistance, all these different mechanisms. Because this year the U.S. contributed $1 billion globally for the fight against climate disruption elsewhere. The budget request this year was $10 billion, which is better, but it's still not even close to what is needed, nor really commensurate with what the US's responsibility. We need progressive redistribution. This gets a little bit wonky through things like IMF special drawing rights. But we also need to contend with global South debt through an entirely new global debt framework. And this is something that Biden could really push by convening a global summit specifically to deal with climate and debt simultaneously. Finally, this is kind of on our wish list to whenever there are civil and criminal penalties against fossil fuel companies, some portion of those penalties need to be redirected to the South. So, here in Maryland, the city of Baltimore has an ongoing suit against fossil fuel companies for the damages that are going to be incurred by the city as a result of the changing climate. Some portion of that should be redirected to the South also, such that they have more resources to determine how to deal with the climate crisis on their own terms. And in terms of the social movement components of this, we didn't come up with these recommendations out of thin air. We're really trying to amplify the voices of debt justice and climate justice organizations all over the world from the CARICOM Reparations Committee to the Campaign to Abolish Illegitimate Debt, to Acción Ecológico in Ecuador, and the Pacto Ecosocial del Sur, Third World Network in Malaysia. All these groups are working on debt cancellation as a matter of urgency, as a priority for climate justice. And we see this playing out in the streets now as the IMF is effectively imposing a new era of structural adjustment on all of these countries facing debt crises. So this is in Ecuador. We also see protests in Zambia and in Argentina, and all of these countries that are being subjected to a new round of structural adjustment, limiting their capacity to invest in low carbon development and self-determined adaptation priorities, basically incurring a new round of austerity, right? So these are movements against austerity, for debt justice, and for climate reparations. And we think that there's a lot of potential in this because it works, right? Not to do a big old back in my day, but there were loud cries for debt justice in the anti and altered globalization movement of the late 1990s. Of course, it culminated really, or crescendoed, I should say, in Seattle at the World Trade Organization protests. And those voices ultimately were heard. What this graph here on the bottom left shows you is the results of the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, which was led by the Clinton administration in the late 90s after a lot of pressure from activist groups around the world and in the US, where the poorest countries in the world had a lot of their debt wiped clean. And what this graph shows you is the proportion of kids enrolled in elementary schools in these highly indebted poor countries. You see that after debt cancellation, enrollment rates go from under 60% to over 90% because countries have the fiscal space, basically the money to invest in their education systems and get more kids into school. And so if we're thinking about the most urgent priorities around development and climate action, canceling that debt is one of the most impactful ways that the US could really show some real climate leadership. And so, this is basically a call to other eco-socialists, to DSA members, to consider the international ramifications and dynamics of the Green New Deal. It's not solely a domestic issue. We need to really have a broader focus and build movements around international solidarity, as well as solidarity in our own communities.
Thank you, Patrick. I actually have a question for you. So you mentioned the IMF a few times. It's the International Monetary Fund. But I think one of the issues of when we talk about international finance is that most people don't know very much about it. Its effects may be very visible, but the ways in which the structures of money and power internationally actually play out can sometimes seem a little bit invisible, if not just kind of be in the background or difficult to understand. So in one sense, could you explain what role the IMF plays in this kind of trade-off between the two different kinds of countries, the countries that have better credit rates and are more flexible when it comes to adapting to the climate, and then those who can't and don't have that. So you talk about the IMF role in that briefly, and then also how do we take things that seem complex, even if they are complex, such as the IMF's relationship to this, and then break it down to regular everyday people?
Absolutely, and I mean that sort of opacity and that technocratic approach to managing the world economy is not an accident, right? I mean, these things are meant to be appear complex and scary, like all finances, right? And so a lot of it really does come down to the political education work that y'all do and that we all do in our communities, in trying to explain things like how fundamentally undemocratic the IMF is, right? The IMF operates like a business where it's $1, one vote, not one member, one vote, unlike the UN, right? And so the US has effectively had a veto on progressive action at the IMF since its founding after World War II. And so that's another reason, though, that it's really imperative that in the US we organize on these issues, because the US does have such an outsized role in determining IMF policy. And as far as explaining the importance of this stuff to everyday folks, and I think that you can draw a really good comparison with household debt. I mean, we shouldn't reduce national economies to households, and we shouldn't, it's dangerous to think about them that way. But we can think about, if you've got this debt overhang, if you have, are having a hard time paying your credit card bills, that makes it really hard for you to invest in weatherizing your house, right? And there's these kinds of metaphors that I think we can take in our organizing and show how all of these struggles are connected. And they often have the same bad guy, right? BlackRock owns a tremendous amount of Zambian debt that they're going to make 110% profit on, while the country undergoes austerity and debt restructuring led by the IMF, right? BlackRock that also is controls 20% of the U.S. stock market and plays an outsized political role in facilitating QE that benefits bankers and not regular folks, right? So we've got shared enemies, right? We have more in common with folks in the global South than we do with the bankers, for sure.
Awesome, thank you. So with that, we actually have our guest speaker or special guest tonight, Sarahana. Sarahana is currently running for New York State Assembly in the 103rd District. She's been a lifelong climate organizer, and I'm very excited to talk to you particularly about how your campaign came out of New York's push for public power, and then also what revolutionary potential particularly exists being in a role of power, vying for that power. So just more specific questions towards that end. How did your campaign come out of the fight for public power in New York? How does being an elected DSA official better position you to actually enact some of those changes? How is Green New Deal policy connected with democracy? And what strategies are you deploying, and what kind of revolutionary potential exists within that framework? So what's coming out of the campaign that we can look to, and then once you hopefully win your position, what radical potential for change also exists there?
Thank you so much. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, I'm calling from the street. So my name is Sarahana Shrestha, and I am actually a first-generation immigrant from Nepal. That's where I was born and raised. So I actually came into, I got into local New York State politics through the lens of the idea of a global Green New Deal, because my experience growing up is formed by being in the global South. I probably knew about the IMF before I knew about anything else. There's a lot of presence of the American Embassy, for example. They do a lot of programs through USAID, and some of it is, needs scrutiny. But it's one of those countries where the trajectory of the country's progress is very much defined by donor countries, and whether it's in Europe or the US. So I came into local state politics realizing that the only way to have an impact on global politics, especially through the lens of the New Deal, is to change local politics here. If New York can push for public power, if New York can push for a left majority government, if New York can push for taxing the rich and prioritizing people's well-being, maybe we can have a rippling effect for national politics, because America is right at the center of it's the thing that holds everything together in terms of foreign policy, in terms of what happens to countries like Nepal in the global South. So what I'm doing locally is, we are fighting for local Green New Deal with public power. That's the coalition that I organize with, that has a lot of DSA chapters. And we have the New York Power Authority in New York, which is the country's largest energy provider. But we have ridiculous state laws that really curbs what it can do in the state. And what we want to do is we want to unleash its potential as one of the public organizations that can get us on the track for public power. And right as we started campaigning for this run for state assembly, because state assembly is one of the, is the key part of the New York State legislature that's holding up a lot of progressive things. So right around when we started campaigning, what happened is we had an ice storm in our district in Ulster County that took out power for up to 4 days. And right after that, we got a huge price hike from Central Hudson. That was a $46 increase on the supply side of the energy price, which is, basically fracked gas that our energy system is now relying on. So it has become very easy now to talk to folks at the door about the idea of a publicly owned energy system, about the idea of energy as a public good. Before, I admit I struggled, talking about it in sort of an easy to understand way because it gets wonky very quickly. But now people really want to talk about this idea of publicly owned energy system, of democracy in our energy system, and how that can be a model for how we fight the climate crisis, how that is a key ingredient for Green New Deal, and for combating climate crisis in a sustainable and long-term way, because we have been putting all of our resources and energy into half measures that get us nowhere. And I think ultimately, we just have to take public goods out of the hands of private corporations. And that's what we've been organizing people on at the doors. And it is very well received. I think the idea of energy being in the hands of corporate monopolies is not popular at all. It's very easy for people to understand that that is not how it should be.
Great, thank you, Sarahana. So I have a follow-up question for you. You being a DSA member, a very active one at that, who's been deeply involved in the climate work, what separates you from another candidate, or specifically your opponent, the incumbent who's been in office for a long time? Not just you and your policies, but also kind of talking about the way that being a movement candidate puts you in a unique position to make change.
Yeah, so first of all, as DSA, we only do elections if we can use it to foreground issues, right? We don't do elections just to win. We want to do elections so that we can use it as a medium for organizing our, wherever we live, our local residents into the ideas that we believe in. So that is, the most important part about how we're going to win this race. In both the short term by actually winning the election, but also how we're going to win in the long term. The incumbents will try to outrace us. They will dump the money into ads and mailers like we've already seen. But the quality of conversations that we are having at the door, which we are able to have because we have a field team of volunteers who are putting their time because they truly want to change the world that they live in. So we are having very high quality, very very bonding conversations at the doors, because people are very anxious about climate. They're very anxious about the fact that they vote for people that are supposed to be the best option, and yet nothing gets done. So I think that the idea is to have a long-term base building for an organization like DSA, so that it's not seen as something curious or something novel. And in our district, which is District 103, which is actually quite progressive, it voted 60% for Bernie Sanders. There are a lot of older people who identify as leftists, who are not at all scared by the talking points of buying out a corporate monopoly like Central Hudson. So we have a lot of people who have been sort of fighting for very similar things for a long time, but just electorally there has not been a space for it. So that's why we're trying to revitalize and sort of rebuild our options for what we can do electorally, because just legislatively a lot of things are getting held up, but that's where we want to out organize our incumbent and really win on the issues.
Awesome, thank you. Now, Sarahana, I know you may not be able to stay with us till the end of our event, which is totally okay, because we are going to go into the Q&A portion. So just give me a quick thumbs up, thumbs down, if you'll be able to stick with us for an extra 10, 15 minutes.
I unfortunately no.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. I just wanted to ask. All right, well, I appreciate you making it out tonight. And so with that, we're going to move into our Q&A portion. So again, Sarahana, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your night. Get home safe.
Thank you so much. And I really love that you are having a panel about this issue that I deeply care about. Thank you.
Yes, we need to be talking more about it. Thank you. All right, so with that, we're going to go into our Q&A portion. So if you haven't asked any questions yet, definitely now is the time. I'm going to look over some of the questions, throw them out there. Some of them may be questions that anybody can answer, so we may get some multiple answers from people. Some of them are more particular. So one to start that I thought was interesting that I just caught was using modern monetary theory to talk about economics that may be difficult to understand. I'm certainly no expert on that. I couldn't define it beyond what the acronym means. But Patrick, perhaps you will be able to kind of give some insight on whether modern monetary theory is useful for the conversations about like international money and its role in climate change. Is that something that you can talk about?
No, is the short answer. I don't know a tremendous amount about MMT. What I do know is about how resources have been mobilized during the pandemic and how they could be applied to international climate finance. I took a graph off of here that showed QE, quantitative easing from the big four central banks since 2020 versus total global South debt, or sorry, I should say low-income country debt, both public and private, and the printing presses for QE have spun out 6 times more money than all of the debt held by low-income countries combined. So if we're willing to do it to prop up asset prices, I think that there's the potential to do it for, I don't know, more desirable things. But I don't want to wade into MMT stuff too much because I will probably get my ass kicked by somebody who knows more than I.
That's perfectly fine. Yeah, and if anybody doesn't have a perfect answer to any of these questions, do not stress about that. Try your best to answer. And if you don't have an answer, nothing's wrong with saying I don't know how to answer. I have had to do that many times in my life, so I'm used to that. Oh, Sean, do you actually have an answer to that?
I would just say very briefly that I think that just to reinforce the point that I made at the end of my case study is that I think that monetary policy is something that we as socialists and leftists should be doing a lot of internal political education on. To get to your question, Evan, we should be finding ways to create tools and write books and do the ways to connect those policy levers and theoretical systems to on the ground work. And also I think that one of our main tasks right now, as DSA members, as militants in the workplace and in our communities, should really be about identifying the strategic campaigns that are necessary to change people's immediate material conditions. And we have to be able to work with technical experts and I think have the debates. I think that there are debates around what monetary policy levers should exist. And I think that there's a lot of fluctuating things in the world economy right now. And as Patrick said, I don't want to get my ass kicked by any MMTers. But dollar hegemony is something that I think is we have to be thinking about in the long term. And I think it raises questions around MMT. And so that's a debate that we should continue to have. But as we continue to debate those things, we always have to stay grounded in the historical agent of power that we as socialists believe, which is workers and community members coming together and building that power that's necessary from the ground up in order to achieve the political horizon that we want to achieve.
Thank you. Yes, definitely developing those tools and finding ways to explain things that we can take from the technical experts and break down further for people, give them the analytical tools that they need. I think another good way to look at it is that if we don't do the explaining, somebody else might, and that might not be correct, or that might not be towards the conclusions that we would like them to have. There's concerns of eco-fascism on the horizon, and not being able to break down the economic elements that are happening real time, but between countries and on a scale that maybe people don't see. We might have some of those motions towards a future that's less democratic be fueled by those in ways that people don't understand because we didn't take the time to break it down. But getting beyond the question, I have another one. So somebody wrote, we live in Maryland and are part of a dozen state regional greenhouse gas initiative that basically is just cap and trade for utilities, but it's regional to the mid-Atlantic and New England. Do formations like this offer a path to wider organizing, or are they more of a regional barrier? Keith, I think that might be a good question for you.
Yeah, I caught that one and was interested in it too. Well, short story, cap and trade isn't going to fix climate crisis. I think we probably all agree on that. That just maybe if you put some astronomical price in carbon, it might bend the curve a little bit of what capitalists would do. But they're going to fight that ever happening. So it's not the problem is still how do we get the political power to stop fossil fuels from getting burnt one way or another. That's what we gotta figure out, among many other problems. In California, we've had cap and trade relatively long in the United States, and a huge amount of the proceeds from selling carbon permits goes into a public fund that is this like huge cash cow to be split up at the legislature and through some state agencies. And some of that funding has gone to interesting things. I mean, it's been a backbone of some okay affordable housing programs, definitely not what you would call social housing. It's helped keep the high-speed rail program alive, which is not perfect either, but has at least helped those union jobs happen. So organizing around the money from the cap and trade program could be a good unifying kind of thing, like having money on the table that is in a way kind of taxing, you could say it's taxing corporations, not as directly as we would like, but it's a step that can be a rallying thing for organizers. And I've seen that in the Fresno area where I've studied that's been like a target, is how do we get the greenhouse gas reduction funds like money here? So that's something. As for the connections across the region, there's been an interesting set of connections around between environmental justice groups and other like left environmental groups saying like cap and trade is bad because it still allows pollution to happen in poorer communities. Like it's just saying you can write off, basically, if you're willing to pay for polluting, you can pollute wherever you want. And so there's been some solidarity around that idea, opposition from groups saying this is just continuing a system of putting the shadiest of stuff in our backyards. So maybe not the direct hopeful answer you're looking for, but there are ways that the limits of that kind of like liberal or capitalist approach to climate change like inspires people to connect dots and fight over some of the money that might be generated.
If I can just follow up on that real quick. I mean, one of the key points that I think Keith brought up is this greenhouse gas reduction fund, and the way that it does fund good things. It funds some not so good things, but it does a lot of work around like forest restoration that reduces forest fire risk for vulnerable communities in the Sierra, while also building up good quality woods work in deindustrialized rural communities. But that doesn't happen by accident, right? There's no, the initial cap and trade law didn't say that 40% of GGRF funds had to go to disadvantaged communities, right? People had to organize and fight for that. And so I think there's a lesson there that like, even where you're sort of stuck with this crappy neoliberal environmental policy, there are ways to organize around it that then results in more kind of investment-led approaches that we would see commensurate with the Green New Deal. And in terms of RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Mid-Atlantic, unfortunately, it's such a wonky thing. As somebody who writes about carbon markets, like I still don't really understand how like RGGI auctions work. And it's again like this like technocratic approach is on purpose. You're not supposed to be able to sort of engage with it. And so one of the things that I've often wondered about is if there's a way, like Keith said, to raise the auction floor price so high that it effectually becomes a carbon tax, or you push your state legislators to radically reduce the number of offsets that can be used, such that polluters are fully compensating at whatever price, and then move that, use that as a basis to start, moving the goalposts a little bit. And these are policies that can be changed.
Thank you. So there's a couple questions that were asked towards this end, so I'm going to kind of synthesize them a little bit. There were some questions about, when we're talking about racial capitalism or environmental justice, there's an intersection there, right? Particularly, it tends to be a racial capitalism playing a role in that people of color are the ones who can often be the ones most affected by climate change. Something that comes to mind as a recent thing was, I believe that the military had been basically poisoning the water in Hawaii for like the last year or so, or if not longer. And so, like, how do we as DSA, as organizers, as local chapters, on whatever level we're operating on, how do we extend our solidarity to them? How do we make sure that we're not just generalizing the struggle, but that we can highlight the particularities of the struggle and work with the people who have been on the front lines, organizing towards that end, and also suffering from it? Like, how do we put ourselves in a position to be there? I know it's not an easy question by no means, but does anyone have any answers to that?
I can take an initial stab. I think Keith did a really great job covering like a very specific campaign example. But for me, I saw that question in the list, and I was thinking about it. And the example that comes to mind is that when we were writing the proposal to do this democratized ComEd campaign, one of the things that we did was go and have conversations with a lot of the organizations that had been around, been doing long-term base building in Chicago. Chicago's hub for environmental justice work. Many of the organizations like the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization and others have been very involved in national work. So, I had a couple conversations with the folks that were running that, and they basically said, like, we have all of our hands tied right now working on a statewide policy bill because there had been a statewide push to pass a really transformative energy bill, and they were working on a follow-up act. And they basically were like, this sounds like a great idea. We can't participate, like, good luck. I think that down the line, we did run into people who basically were like, well, why are you not following the lead of Vallejo and doing XYZ thing? And we basically were like, look, we had conversations with them, and this intervention is a strategic intervention that needs to be made. And like, for me personally, I went through a period of time where I think that I let like my guilt about being like a white person and as somebody who grows up in the global north and all of that paralyze me, especially when I thought about the climate crisis. And now I sort of like refuse to be paralyzed. And instead, I think that the way that we need to think about it is actually building relationships with other people who might be experiencing the oppressions of capitalism differently, whether it is through race, gender, sexuality, being somebody who grew up in one of the countries that's been ravaged by international foreign policy, etc. And through that, then building the campaigns and building the organizations that allow us to like identify what those divisions are and the different ways that they affect people, and then come together across lines of difference. And that's what solidarity means. Solidarity is not about being atomized and like feeling guilty until somebody tells me what to do. It's about actually struggling together and like keeping our eye trained on the ones who are trying to foment those divisions and like building the power necessary to take them down.
Excellent, thank you. And it does, yeah, like, you were talking about like that international element. I think that also plays a strong role in it, particularly when we're talking about like the effects of US colonialism on other countries where those relationships basically still exist. And it's not just the US, a lot of European countries. I believe that France is still collecting debt from some of the countries that it had a colonial relationship with. So like these things still exist, they're still in motion, and it still has tangible impact. So I think building the relationship internationally too, with movements, people who were who are living in countries that were previously colonies and are, in a sense, de facto colonies today through the international finance. Patrick, do you have anything that maybe you can add in that dimension on that?
Sorry, what particular dimension?
Talking about like the colonial relationship that exists and how when we're trying to be supportive, uplifting, and at times be a leading role in uniting with BIPOC people as they struggle against racial capitalism in the international context. Because we were kind of talking at the local level with Sean. Where does that come in at the international level? How do we kind of strive for that level of advocacy and organization?
I mean, I think that it's like, my experience organizing as a white person in the U.S. with communities of color, and it's not the same, but it's similar insofar as, you have to make a real commitment to listen and to amplify voices if you're in a position to do so. Like you said, in this debt work, we consulted with a number of debt justice organizations from around the world, and we're sometimes surprised by what folks said. And you have to take those demands seriously, and you have to amplify them as they sort of mesh with those that you're hearing from other places. So, for example, climate justice campaigners in South Africa told us that they would really prefer we didn't demand, unconditional cash transfers with sort of no strings attached, because they actually found some kind of level of conditionality a useful kind of stick to beat their own politicians with in terms of demanding better climate investment with money that was coming in from like the Green Climate Fund, right? Which is not something in a million years that I ever would have sort of come up with, because, in terms of speaking for reparations, unconditional cash transfers are absolutely the gold standard, right? But you have to sort of respect those demands that people on the ground are making, because they're the ones who understand the sort of lived reality of living under austerity and sort of climate apartheid, or most directly.
All right, great. I have one last question for everybody before we tie it up tonight, because we are hitting about 10 p.m. on the East Coast here. So I'll go in the same order, Sean, Keith, Patrick. We've talked a lot about the revolutionary potential in these organizing examples. But how do we reach beyond our kind of networks as they exist already, right? Because we're talking about building a mass democratic movement, and that's a very difficult and at times overwhelming task. So particularly one of the people who were here today asked a question about maybe reaching out to religious leaders as an example of the way that we can kind of get beyond the bounds here. Even in my chapter, a lot of the mutual aid work that we do is through local churches who are very happy to collaborate with us, give us the space, donate some resources. And so like those kind of connections help us reach an audience that might be more difficult to reach in other ways. So I just want to ask the question, we talked a lot about revolutionary potential, but acting on it, how do we expand our horizons to get more people pulled in? That could be in any number of ways. I'm just curious to see what everyone's thoughts are before we tie it up. So,
yeah, totally. Just very quickly, I think the way that you have to do it is strategically. We are not going to be able to just like go and hand out flyers to everybody walking down the street. That can be a way to do it, but it should be done like within geographic bounds for an electoral campaign or outside of a work site if people are organizing a union or XYZ constituencies, whatever. So like with a religious community, they might be part of a network of people that can move somebody to execute a campaign, and they're on the list of constituencies that you have identified. And that is a way for people who are, whether they're new organizers or veteran organizers, are going to be able to essentially create parameters for themselves and create a target universe of people that need to be organized that then are actually made real. And you do that again with the people that are in the room with you that you want to run a campaign and win a campaign. That is just sort of like where my head has been at for a long time, where it continues to be at, is that I think we have to identify the specific people organize the people that are in that room together. And then from there, they have their networks of people, whether it's the work site or the other constituencies that they're a part of. And then we inspire people with a political vision. We win, and winning is something that makes people feel good and changes their immediate material conditions. And then they are able to move and feel like they are in the struggle as well. And we keep growing and we keep growing. And then we're there and we have those formal organizational structures that Keith talked about that are able to be there for decades and are a strong and sturdy foundation. And like, that's it.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you. Keith, your turn.
Myself included, I think we often have kind of got it backwards in DSA, where we feel like we have this great socialist idea and now we're going to recruit people to join our organization and do this idea because, you know, the masses are just waiting for this idea to strike. And with like Medicare for all, even a Green New Deal, you know, those ideas are in circulation. There's some popularity there, but there aren't like mass campaigns, you know, in a lot of places, at least around those already. So I think the other way to approach our role as DSA is to look for places where people are already getting involved for the first time in politics or taking new kinds of action, you know, being more militant, taking risks they haven't taken before. Like transit workers in the East Bay, a lot of new people were getting involved around a demand for hazard pay during COVID and still hadn't gotten anything for a couple of years. The Richmond Progressive Alliance in Richmond, California, just north of here in the East Bay, that has brought a lot of people into struggle around fighting racism and police violence, around fighting Chevron, that have never, you know, been super active before. And those moments when new people are stepping into the fight, we should like go there and try and learn from like what's inspiring people, how can we support them for the long haul. I think the workplace is a really special place to do that because people have to keep showing up every day. When we put ourselves in workplaces, we organize with like more diverse people than you'll see in most political organizations, DSA included, because people have to be there from whatever their background, and you build relationships there that are really strong and have a kind of leverage that we need. So those are some approaches I think could help us.
Thank you. And Patrick.
I don't have a tremendous amount to add to those both really fantastic answers from Sean and Keith, aside from meeting people where they're at and, you know, just thinking strategically, really the importance that's going to come from organizing around state policy over the next electoral cycle and beyond, and really giving folks a chance to get involved with politics in places where they can maybe see the needle move a little bit more directly. I mean, it's exciting to be part of big national campaigns, but there's really nothing that beats you know, going and canvassing or lobbying with your state rep. And as far as DSA is concerned, I don't know, we should ask whoever is in charge of organizing the new chapter of Frederick DSA, who reached out to me, and I'm very excited that Frederick, Maryland is having its first DSA chapter meeting on Sunday. And so I'm just happy to be brought along.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank all of our guests for coming out tonight. We're going to share some of the links that we have with more information, like, for example, Sarahana's website. So any of the speakers, if you have any links that you sent earlier, definitely send them again in the chat now so that people in the audience can check them out. Anything else that you want them to look at, I'll give you like 2 minutes to do that. But yeah, this has been a great session. I enjoyed speaking with everybody and getting all the different perspectives. And the goal tonight was not to be doom and gloom. You know, we generally get the idea that climate change is real, the crisis is here, and it's not getting better on its own. It's going to take a mass movement to do that. And so tonight was more of a hopeful conversation where we got to talk about a lot of the potentialities that exist in work that's happened before and work that's ongoing and work that we can look towards in the future through a multitude of different lenses. So yeah, this has been a great conversation. One last thanks to Tom for helping pull this together and handling all the tech work in the background. Thank you, Sean, Keith, and Patrick. If anyone would like to make a last statement, you're more than welcome to. I think we're good though, probably tired from talking all night. So with that, I'm gonna call it. But again, thank you everybody. Have a great evening. And let's fight for a Green New Deal. We're in it together. People power.
Thank you for facilitating, Evan.
No problem.
Thanks
Thanks so much, y'all.
Thank you, everybody.